Hi, welcome everybody to the Mellon Center. I know there are a lot of familiar faces in the room, and it's great to see everyone again. We have a lot of people joining online as well. So just to say, my name is Shriya Chatterjee, and I'm head of research initiatives here at the center. So thank you for being here, both online and in person, because it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Holly Shaffer and Laurel Peterson here today. So today's event is about an exhibition, Painters, Poets, and Prophets, Artists in the East India Company, which will open at the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven in January 2026, yes? So Holly and Laurel, as curators of the show, will take us behind the scenes to think through some of the broader research questions that underpin the exhibition. And I've been told that we will also get a little preview of some of the themes and objects explored in the exhibition and the related catalog as well. And I know we're all very much looking forward to this. So I'm just going to introduce the two speakers before handing over to them. And also to say that Holly and Laurel will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A after that. Questions and thoughts are welcome from both in-person audiences as well as everyone online. As you know, it comes kind of magically to my phone, and I can read the questions out. After that, for those of us in the room, there will be drinks and a reception next door, so that's a chance to carry on the conversation. Okay, so Holly Shaffer is Robert Gale Noyes Assistant Professor of Humanities in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Brown University. Her research focuses on 18th and 19th century arts in Britain and South Asia and their intersections. Her first book, Grafted Arts, Art Making and Taking in the Struggle for Western India, 1760 to 1910, was published by the Paul Mellon Center with Yale University Press in 2022. And I know many of you in the room are familiar with it as well. In 2011, Holly curated Adapting the Eye, an archive of the British in India at the YCBA, and in 2013, Strange and Wondrous Prints of India from the Robert J. Del Bonta collection at the National Museum of Asian Art. Laurel O. Peterson is the Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven. She specializes in British works on paper produced during the long 18th century. She served as the organizing curator for John Singer Sargent Portraits in Charcoal in 2019 and as co-curator of Architecture, Theatre and Fantasy, Bibiana Drawings from the Jules Fisher Collection in 2021, both at the Morgan Library and Museum. She received a PhD in the history of art from Yale and has held positions at the British Museum around the corner and the Morgan Library. So over to Holly and Laurel. Thank you.
So thank you so much for the introduction. We're thrilled to be here. And as Shriya mentioned, our exhibition opens at the Yale Center for British Art in January 2026. And it's part of a really exciting program of exhibitions that begin with the YCBA's reopening, which happens on March 29th. So mark your calendars. It's going to be a thrill to see the reinstalled collection. And also one of the programs that will be moving forward are a series of exhibitions really dedicated to the YCBA's rich collection of historic works of art drawn from our own collection.
So one of the particularly fruitful aspects of the exhibition Laurel and I have been working on is its collaborative nature. We have worked closely with paintings and paper conservators, conservation scientists, and scholars from a range of institutions and specialties, and our talk today highlights this collaborative research. We bring that collaborative aspect being in company with so many people here, including yourselves, and we're really grateful to you for being here. And we would also like to remember those who have contributed so much to this field, and for that we would like to remember Natasha Eaton and her work. So we formatted this talk as a dialogue. So Laurel and I will discuss the key works of the show and its framing questions with this kind of spirit of collaboration in mind.
So let's begin with this luscious presentation, which advertises the bounty of a colonial commodity. The breadfruit had long captured the European imagination. First aware of the fruit from the South Pacific, Europeans envisioned this starchy fruit as a kind of natural bread that grew without human labor. In 1787, the naturalist and president of the Royal Society, Joseph Banks, spearheaded the effort to transplant breadfruit trees to the Caribbean to serve as an easy-to-grow food source for the enslaved population. The fruit garnered interest in India as well, particularly following the Bengal famine of 1769-70, in which approximately 10 million people died. The British East India Company, which had financial control over Bengal, bore responsibility and financial interest in the well-being of the region's people. One of the aims of the Botanic Garden established in Calcutta in 1786 was to introduce useful, nutritious plants. The breadfruit was introduced in 1794, but it failed to gain popularity as a foodstuff. And I'll note that with the help of Henry Nolte and others, we've identified the species of fruit here as a bread nut, a wild ancestor of the breadfruit, native to the Malacca Straits.
The materials and inscriptions on this work speak to the intersection of art and commerce across the British Empire. The paper bears the distinctive watermark of the United British East India Company. This is also known as Watman paper, after one of the best-known British papermakers who became the official paper supplier to the company. The painting is also inscribed in 3 languages. At top is the Malay word for the fruit, succoon, followed by one of its Latin botanical names, Artocarpus incisus, followed by the English breadfruit, as the writer identified the produce. The use of the Malay word indicates that this drawing, one of at least 6 in this format, was likely produced by an artist or artists who had migrated from China to the Malacca Straits, where the British East India Company, among other European companies, had a trading post known as a factory after the traders or factors who did business there.
The picture and the fruit it represents is part of a broader history of the arts related to the British East India Company, which we will refer to as the company. The company was an early joint stock corporation in which individuals pooled their money to trade in lucrative goods like fruit and vegetables, spices, textiles, and gems across Asia. Granted a charter by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, the company had gained territorial control through military force over many ports and regions of India by 1800, as you can see in the darkest red color on the map. They also had access to key ports across the Indian Ocean through the establishment of factories, such as in Canton, present-day Guangzhou. Thus, by 1800, the company's business involved trading goods and acting as mercenaries and tax collectors. Note that we will describe the arts made under the auspices of the company, rather than for the company, because artists working in Asia were primarily employed by specific company patrons on private commissions, or they made pictures to sell to a general company market, rather than making works for the board of directors in London. Indeed, the company was explicit about outsourcing artistic patronage and the representation of information to private individuals, although they benefited from their research all the same.
The works in this exhibition and its multi-author catalog are tied to the collections at the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut, in North America. Most of these pictures were collected in the second half of the 20th century by the benefactor of both the Yale Center for British Art and this institution, Paul Mellon. Mellon was the son of the banker, industrialist, philanthropist, politician, and art collector, Andrew W. Mellon. And he was particularly devoted to British art and the former British Empire. That included the arts of the former British Empire. And the works that we're focusing on in this exhibition relate to the cities and ports in which the British either held power or sought to hold power in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They illuminate how artists moved and worked across a range of cities like Lucknow and Patna on rivers and through ports like Calcutta, present-day Kolkata, and Canton, present-day Guangzhou. These skilled artists were trained in different regions, especially in Britain, India, and China, and they also came from varied backgrounds, artistic backgrounds. Some were soldiers trained in draftsmanship and surveillance. Others were schooled in art academies or court workshops. Others were part of families of artists making art for popular or devotional markets, and others were self-trained. They made goods that flowed across empires and represented hundreds of commodities that held or might hold value. Documenting pertinent as well as fantastical information about the societies in which the company sought to do business, they also visually parsed the culture that developed around the members of the company itself.
There are unique caches of work at the YCBA and at Yale more broadly that have prompted the main questions and the themes of the show. And the show is structured geographically, reflecting those groupings. Significant groups include the Mallet Whales Archive, which is a unique collection of works from the Western Indian city of Pune, present-day Pune. This comprises works by Indian and British popular, court, academic, and military artists and illuminates workshop practice in this period. There are also a range of portraits by the renowned artists Lam Qua and Ting Qua and those in their circle in Canton, such as this beauty, and works by George Chinnery, who worked across India and China. The YCBA also holds 13 albums written and illustrated by James Forbes, whose letters, drawings, and collected works document his travel not only within Asia as a company officer, but also across the Americas and Africa. While some of these archives allow for an unprecedented insight into artists' lives, such as that of Gangaram Tambat, or into artist workshops, others leave us with questions. Many of these artists' names and histories are now unknown to us. And to address those gaps, we've worked closely with paper and paintings conservators, as well as conservation scientists, in order to study the artistic materials and techniques to gain a better understanding of how artists who were working under the auspices of the company and how these materials guided their practice. In sum, these clusters of work have focused our attention on artistic practice, artistic materials, and artistic connections across Asia.
It's also critical to recognize what this exhibition is not doing, and in the process to recognize the work of other exhibitions and publications. While there are moments in the Yale Center for British Arts collection where you can see that artists were working for other patrons, such as the market for popular devotional works of art in Western India, as we can see in relation to Gangaram Tambat's practice, or the arts at the top there, or the circulation of Mughal paintings and Chinese bird and flower paintings. For the most part, the works are connected to company patronage, rather than the multiple patrons for whom we know artists worked, as seen in the intersection of Mughal and company patrons in Princes and Painters in Mughal Delhi, edited by William Dalrymple and Yutika Sharma, or Beyond the Page by Hamid Nasser and Emily Hanam, among others. While we are attuned to the intimacies of the four continents, as Lisa Lowe has cogently described the global networks of colonialism, which exhibitions like Hugh Locke On Now at the British Museum, Entangled Past at the Royal Academy, and Artists and Empire at Tate Britain, and books like Art in the British Empire explored, as well as so many others. Forgive me for us for not being able to put everything up. Our exhibition is focused on the East India Company in Asia, inspired by exhibitions like Forgotten Masters and learned in the extensive work on this subject by Mildred Archer. We aim to highlight the brilliant artists who worked under the auspices of the company. However, drawing on the strengths and implications of the Yale Center for British Arts collections, our focus probes a series of questions. We discuss artists trained across Britain, China, and India, and their intersections with one another, as well as their engagements with a range of artistic materials, techniques, and circulating works of art.
So with that background about the collection and its relationship to others in mind, we'd like to frame the three questions that animate the exhibition, Painters, Ports, and Profits. The first, is there a company art? And if so, how do we define it? The second, how does an examination of artistic materials like pigments and paper offer insight into artistic practices formed under the auspices of the East India Company, particularly when the names and life stories of many artists are now unknown to us? And third, who are the artists who worked under the auspices of the East India Company, and how did their works or artistic materials intersect across Asia?
Let's begin with the first question. Is there a company art? And this watercolor. Pinks and yellows push the inky sky into dawn and light the way for a procession of travelers. 2 soldiers or sepoys, men who bear torches, luggage and palanquins, and those who are seated in them, a company officer and his bibi or female companion. Beyond identifying their jobs, we don't know who these people are, only that they are winding their way from a village marked by a South Indian-style temple toward a future destination. The subject of this picture is travel. Here, traveling means to travel with others, in company, through different lands, times, and seasons in pursuit of profits. Centered on a company official and the extensive trade corporation that he represents, the picture also concerns all the others who are in company with him. A company of soldiers, the intimate company of a woman, the company of the villagers just past and those to come. We might also include the artist or artists, as well as the art materials used in this picture's company.
Indeed, although these artists' names are now unknown to us, through technical imaging, we're able to identify the materials that they used, as well as some of their artistic processes. As with the bread nut, they used Watman paper produced in England. We can see the watermark when we turn the picture on its side and shine a light through it. The artists also used a valuable local pigment known as Indian yellow to make this rich golden color. We can see how this pigment fluoresces a brilliant shade under ultraviolet illumination, allowing us to note the ways in which the flares, asari, the central palanquin, and even the brilliant border use this color. And we'll return to the significance of this pigment later on. Through a study of artistic materials, we can see how artists brought papers and pigments from different regions, here England and Bengal, together to construct this work. They also grafted different styles and compositions together. In this small sheet, meant to be examined carefully in your hand or bound into an album, the artist or artists drew on Indian and British subjects and techniques, including a streaked golden sky reminiscent of late Mughal paintings, and pictures of palanquins circulating in Europe and Indian painted and printed works. The artists skillfully mixed materials, compositions, and styles to cater to a specific company official or a more general market for company-related art in India or even globally.
In this project, we focus on artists trained in Britain, China, and India who worked under the auspices of the company and on arts made in connection to the company in Asia. These works are linked together through a global corporation and its intersection with other ones. Indeed, the term company painting has been thoughtfully questioned for this reason by such scholars, including Henry Nolte, who's with us today. It foregrounds the company and its capitalist regime rather than the myriad artists who made the work. The term company painting developed among British and Indian artists, art historians, and colonial officials in the first half of the 20th century in India, as Yutika Sharma and I have delved into in an essay in Archives of Asian Art. They used it to define a kalam or shaili, a style or school of making art, in which artists mixed Mughal and British artistic techniques. Like we saw with the traveling palanquins and these works on the screen, in large-scale oil paintings and watercolors, as well as smaller-scale miniatures and sketches. They also depicted subjects that catered to a company clientele, as Mildred Archer recognized in British institutional collections, including portraits, architecture, landscape, manners and customs, flora and fauna, and occupational types. Most of these subjects connect to company interests, including negotiating with powerful local rulers, learning information about the customs, histories, and arts of the country they sought to control, documenting their domestic and social lives, including servants and sports, learning about plants and animals that could hold commercial or scientific value. In this early 20th century definition, artists could work in this style, a company column or a company style, alongside other ones like a deli style or a deli column, and many did. However, over the course of the latter half of the 20th century and the institutionalization of company art in England, the term came to be defined more rigidly by ethnicity, as specifically Indian artists who worked for the company or company patrons. Other artists who worked under the auspices of the company, such as British artists or Chinese artists, whose works were intended for a company clientele, weren't included within this term. Indeed, work by Chinese artists, for instance, has come to be called trade or export art. We'd like to investigate company art in terms of style, or a column, that artists trained in varied regions and techniques could dip in and out of, as many of the artists who were working under the auspices of the company did.
Now, let's delve into our second question. How does an examination of artistic materials like pigments and paper offer insight into artistic practices formed under the auspices of the East India Company, particularly when the names and life stories of many artists are now unknown to us? The global trade in which the company operated meant that artists trained in different regions and manners of making art interacted with one another in person, as well as through circulating works of art and artistic materials. While we know historically that pigments and papers are moving through these trade networks, it can sometimes be hard to envision or understand how they moved or were used. Early on in the exhibition process, we turned to our colleagues in paper conservation, Soyeon Che and Anita Day, as well as the conservation scientists at Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. And those scientists were Richard Hark and Marcy Wiggins. And I'm going to take us through some of the technical imaging and analysis work that our scientist colleagues have done, which bring the themes of trade and materials to the fore. And so I'll take you back to the summer of 2022 when Holly and I, along with our colleagues in paper conservation, donned protective glasses and started shining UV lights all over works in the YCBA collection. What we were hunting for is this, the bright yellow fluorescence of Indian yellow. Here we see it not just in the eyes and the legs of the yellow-eyed babbler, but also in the greens of the leaves, indicating that the color was used both purely and as a mixture with blue. We were looking for Indian yellow for a very particular reason. It's a pigment uniquely produced in India, meaning that its place of origin was immediately identifiable. And with UV, it's very easy to find. Other pigments, like ochres and lakes, are much more ubiquitous and difficult to identify. During the period of company rule, the production of Indian yellow was a closely guarded secret, but we now know that the pigment was produced by feeding cows a diet almost entirely comprised of mango leaves and using their urine to create the yellow pigment. This practice was banned beginning in the early 20th century as an inhumane practice, but it was used by artists in India as well as in Europe, such as J.M.W. Turner, until that point. Knowing that Indian yellow was in this work, we wanted to learn more about the other pigments. And scientists used further non-destructive techniques such as X-ray fluorescence, known as XRF, and Raman spectroscopy to map and analyze the elements in these pigments. And so here we see one of the scientists working out at IPCH, working to identify Indian yellow and a mango drawn by James Forbes. I'm showing here 3 chemical maps using XRF produced by Richard Hark. In XRF, the map shows the presence of individual elements. So the greater the concentration of the element, the stronger the signal. And Richard then added color to help us see those maps and help visualize the different elements at play. The maps include several noteworthy pigments. On the left, we see mercury, which is a sign of vermilion, a pigment sourced in China. The iron seen in the leaves is an indication of Prussian blue, a pigment first synthesized in Europe in the early 18th century and then exported around the globe. And then on the right, we see lead, some of which indicates the use of lead white making edits, much like we might use whiteout today. Well, the fact that these pigments are being used, derived from various parts of the East India Company trade networks, is not in itself surprising. It's exciting to understand more about the palette of an artist whose name is no longer known to us, and how that palette was shaped by these commercial forces.
Through this extraordinary bat, we can delve more into artistic practice, particularly the whiteout technique, commonly used by artists trained in the Mughal tradition. In the 1770s and 1780s, there was a trio of artists, Bhavani Das, whose bat you see on the screen, Ram Das, and Sheikh Zainal Din, who produced nearly 300 paintings of flora and fauna for Elijah and Mary Impey, who were company officials, or Elijah was a company judge. And Mary Impey took a keen interest in the natural world. The works of art that she commissioned and these artists, what these artists produce, drew on both European traditions of natural history techniques, artistic techniques that the artists would have developed in Patna, where they were from, and a blend of materials. All of the works were produced on large sheets of Whatman-made paper, like the bread nut, which was both a challenge and an opportunity for the artists to render these animals on a large scale. Here, the tips of the bat's wings extend from one end of the page to the other. And as Navina Haidar writes in her essay in the catalog, artists were challenged to think big, draw big, and follow and interpret the command of Ferengi patrons. Yet, zooming in, we see the meticulous rendering of the fur and the expressive face in that fine brushwork of the Mughal tradition, as Navina also explores. So you're seeing kind of these two ways of working simultaneously. Moreover, in the XRF chemical map, we have a clear sense of the lead white used to tidy up the edges of the bat's wings and feet. And a closer look at the mercury map seen in red around the foot shows that Bhavani Das began this composition with an outline of vermilion. So again, the pigment that was coming from China.
In another example, through conservation analysis, we've been able to identify pigments as well as techniques. One of the most extraordinary works in the show is a 37-foot-long scroll, which you see here in the conservation studio, only partly unfurled. The scroll encourages its viewers to slowly unroll it to reveal the city of Lucknow and to scan the banks of the River Gumti, identifying buildings and their successive owners, as well as products like grass thatch stacked into pyramids, fields irrigated by the river, and various boats and bridges for transport. We don't know if this scroll was made for a British or an Indian patron, even though it ended up with a British owner, nor do we know the names of these Lucknow artists. What we do know through technical analysis is that the artist used Whatman paper, gluing the sheets together and backing them with fabric, and they blended artistic techniques from different traditions. Prussian blue, synthesized and exported from Europe, fills the water that courses along the scroll, while Indian yellow brings vibrancy to the boats sailing on the river and helps the burnished gold to shine at the edges. Artists use translucent watercolor washes to color in the carefully drawn buildings along the shore and dot the leaves of the trees, whereas layers of watercolor in the river and patches of dense gem-like color nod to local traditions. In these three examples, we can see artists experimenting with pigments from all over the world. We see them experimenting with the possibilities and the restrictions of Whatman paper, and we see them using different artistic techniques for different parts of paintings.
This supports our approach to our third framing question. Who are the artists who worked under the auspices of the East India Company? And how did their works or artistic materials intersect across Asia? As the Mughal Empire fragmented over the course of the 18th century, many artists trained in Mughal traditions left Delhi and migrated to cities that held other promising patrons, such as to Faizabad and Lucknow and the rulers or Nawabs there, or to burgeoning commercial centers like Putnam, a city on the Ganges River in eastern India, which was a center for the company's opium production, and Calcutta, the company's main port and center of governance. Artists in Patna in particular, such as these two you see on the screen, identified a market for series of pictures that displayed Indian life, in particular occupational types known as firqa sets in Persian, and ceremonies and customs. In two watercolors of what was a larger set, Jairam Das relates two figures engaged in an occupation. In one, a steward of a household is returning from the market, followed by a bearer carrying their bounty for the day's meals. A second picture displays two women, also differentiated by rank and dress, one before the other carrying water pots on their hips.
We could relate Jairam Das's series to Bhavani Das's Bat, as he and another artist who worked for Impi, Sheikh Zain al-Din, who made this remarkable painting of a stork nibbling on a snail, both noted their artistic origins in Patna. These works fuse Mughal and British traditions. They were produced by a workshop of artists in a series, albeit here at a large scale with considerable funds, as they were privately commissioned by a specific family.
Jairam Das also worked with other artists, such as Shiva Dayal, and he designed his works to be repeatable. One of Jairam Das's drawings of a woman holding a water pot indicates that he used it as a model to trace or copy the composition in other works. And so you see one of his drawings on the left, and then the picture in the Yale Center for British Arts collection in the center. And Charles Doyley, the company's opium agent in Patna in the 1820s, also copied this work. And this composition continued to be copied for generations. On the right, we see the same image, but this time by Bani Lal, working decades later. And many artists in this period worked in the company of others in workshops. And part of the logic of a workshop practice is that it allows for faster production and reproduction, as well as for artists to specialize in their skills. And so these arts, if the bat and the stork were privately made for a specific individual, these arts are made for mass appeal that could be customized to the buyer as needed. These processes of handmade replication were paired in the period with mechanical ones, particularly through lithography. In addition to drawing and painting on paper, Jairam Das and Shiva Dayal worked with prints. They were part of the Bihar Amateur Lithographic Society, which Charles Doyley founded soon after he imported a press to Patna. And we have Tom Young here, who's done such extraordinary work on this material and is also writing about it for the catalog. Two prints pasted adjacent to one another in one of the society's scrapbooks speak to copying practices. Here, Eliza Doyley, who was Charles's wife, and Shiva Dayal have each depicted an Indian woman in regal dress. Their faces are turned in opposite directions, which indicates that one artist could have copied the other, and in the process reversed the composition. And their similarity to Jairam Das's drawing of a water carrier only amplifies the trace of these playful techniques. Eliza's work mirrors Jairam's almost exactly, whereas Shiva Dayal turns the woman to face forward and garbs her in a different pattern.
Turning from Patna to Faizabad and Lucknow, we see academic and court artists Tilly Kettle and Mir Chand intersect, either in person or through their works, in connection to the court of the Nawab or Mughal governor there. In 1772, Kettle traveled from Calcutta to Faizabad to paint portraits for Shuja Udala, the Nawab of the region of Awadh, his family and retinue, as well as company officials and European entrepreneurs working for or with the court. The court was in a particularly tense position at this time. The Nawab controlled vast lands and wealth, but was also indebted to the British. Company forces had defeated the Nawab and his allies at the Battle of Buxar in 1764, but rather than taking over governance of their territories, they negotiated profitable returns. Artists and art became a means for diplomatic engagement for the Nawabs and the company, as well as for entertainment and camaraderie. Set on the grounds or within the palace, Kettle painted portraits, including the 3/4-length oil portrait of the Nawab preparing for a hunt, and a full-length portrait of a woman in red in a red and gold sari holding a hookah. These are large-scale, salon-style, single-person oils painted on canvas and meant to be hung on the wall.
In the milieu of the court, however, artists trained in a refined Mughal manner of painting, in which opaque watercolors are layered and burnished to a high sheen and details achieved through precise brushwork, played with these forms and media. Mir Chand, who worked for officials in the Nawab's circle, brought such portraits of men and women together at a similar scale in the form of a handheld album. On one page, he modeled the Nawab's portrait on kettles, but flanked him with 2 women, each seated before an open window through which cultivated fields or the countryside can be seen. Likewise, Kettle could have accessed Mughal paintings, akin to Mir Chand's, in which portraits of women and men were often put in dialogue. We might think of these works as Mir Chand scaling down Kettle's oil portrait of the Nawab, or of Kettle scaling up Chand's Mughal portraits of beautiful women. In Pune, the capital of the ruling Marathas in Western India, we meet a different company of artists. In this watercolor sketch, 4 artists survey the ruler's temples at the top of a hill from its base. One man steadies an optical device, a viewing frame or a camera obscura, which the other man uses for his depiction. Is this an intellectual endeavor to understand the architecture of the region, or is this a mission in reconnaissance to understand the lay of the land and the sites of importance to the potential allies or foes of the company? The artist, Gangaram Tambat, located, titled, dated, and signed this picture, and perhaps included himself in it. His patron, Charles War Mallet, an ambassador to the Maratha court, also inscribed it. This is a portrait of artists working together for a company agent and their processes of gathering information.
Yet Gangaram Tambat's multiple self-portraits and works drawn in various styles indicate that he was his own agent. In one of his self-portraits, he draws himself sketching, one knee up to support the drawing board, face in profile, eyes steady on what he drafts.
He likely worked for company officials like Mallet, using the tools and comport of that trade, such as the drawing table and viewing frame or camera obscura. But he also likely worked for other patrons or the popular market, using regional materials and techniques, as we see in his self-portrait. Part of what is so fascinating about Tambat's work is that he depicts his use of a range of materials and approaches to produce innovative works.
In one of his largest and most striking watercolors, Gangaram Tambat used the strength and the size of British-made paper to render the portico of the great Chaitya Hall of the Buddhist temple complex at Karla in a very inventive way. The view focuses on the facade, where we see a carved screen at the base with loving couples, Buddhas, and other figures, behind which we can glimpse the arched ceiling of the interior of the temple. Gangaram was trained as a sculptor, and he pays very careful attention to the carvings. But for this drawing, he constructed one large sheet by joining together 6 smaller pieces of paper. The joints are visible on the verso. This emphasizes the scale of the temple, and it also accentuates the sense of a 3-dimensional space. Because rather than being seen flat, as it is today, the darkly shaded strips on the left and right side were likely meant to have been folded forward, as in a diorama. And so the sheet is about this big and would have surrounded you a little bit. The elephant-adorned walls would have flanked the viewer. One of the challenges of rendering this space in one-point perspective is that the vanishing point falls behind the screen. So perhaps by constructing the drawing of the exterior space in 3 dimensions, Gangaram Tambat sought to account for that, giving his patron a sense of the physical power of this sculptural space.
Tambat was part of a group of artists who worked for Charles War Mallet. His story is an avenue into artistic workshops in this period. He knew Mallet and his family well, as seen in a portrait of Mallet's bibi, Ember Core, on the right in an intimate sketch. And Mallet also employed the Scottish artist James Wales, as did the Maratha court. And the court shared Mughal paintings with him, as well as Maratha ones, like this one in Mallet's collection on the left. And his James Wales's wash drawing of a dance on the center left also shows his careful attention to Mughal compositions and entertainments. Wales in turn employed Gangaram Tambat, as well as Robert Mabon, a company soldier, and Jassi, a Goan artist, to help him with commissions. Mabon has here sketched a portrait of the powerful Maratha minister Nana Fadnavis in the center right, which would inform his oil paintings, which Jassi also copied in oil. So you can see kind of how integrated this kind of workshop practice was.
Another family of artists, Lam Qua and Ting Qua, portrayed their idealized studio in Guangzhou for customers in at least 13 copies, as Winnie Wong discusses in the catalog. More of an idea of the space than a documentary representation, the painting displays three painters at work, looking at them up at the model and down at the version they draw, alongside the finished products. A wide range of framed and unframed images are offered for sale: bird and flower paintings, calligraphy, landscapes, portraits, and beauties, each in a different colored garment, hung on the upper right.
We can imagine that the YCBA's penetrating portrait of a woman in blue could have hung in Lam Qua or Ting Qua's shop. Her pointed gaze charms us with specificity. Could this be a real, identifiable person, a noblewoman or a courtesan? Or is she fantastic, an alluring type, a beauty, seducing the viewer to come to the artist's shop and partake of the real and suggested wares in Canton? Like so many artists we've discussed, Lam Qua and Ting Qua worked in concert to produce works for specific patrons or for the market. These groups also intersected explicitly across artistic and company networks in Patna and Canton and Lucknow and Faizabad, but also across India and China.
Lam Qua claimed to have studied with the artist George Chinnery, who also mentored doily in Bengal and Dhaka before moving to Macau. Their works display a profound awareness of the intersection between art and commerce, including artists' keen comprehension of their role in visualizing people's relationships, architecture, and commodities within the hierarchical societies in which they circulated.
In 1762, the company had been granted permission to establish a factory in Canton, which increased their ability to understand the manufacture of Britain's most desired Chinese product, tea, and to engage in its trade. Chinese artists and British artists working from their representations trace the cultivation, processing, and packaging of tea as a systematic path to wealth in large-scale oil paintings. As Romita Ray discusses in the catalog, we see an artist whose name is now unknown to us in the painting on the left, guiding us through multiple tiers that lead the viewer through the processing of the tea plant. European artists were also keen to depict tea. On the right, we see William Daniel's painting. He traveled to China twice with his uncle Thomas, again, in a workshop, right, of artists. And although they described vessels transporting teas, they never mentioned seeing actual tea fields, which indicates that they likely consulted paintings just like this one on the left. And they are literally the exact same size of the similar scale. Laurel, sorry.
Along with tea, opium, the immensely addictive plant product cultivated in India that could match the value of tea grown in China, was paramount to the company's interests, though this commerce was done under subterfuge. From the late 18th century, the company orchestrated and rapidly increased the manufacture of opium in India to be sold in China illegally. akin to the imagery of the step-by-step manufacture of tea in an 1851 publication produced by Walter Sherwell, a company official, revels in the processing, packaging, and transport of the drug to China in a clean, orderly fashion that belies the cruelty of its production and sale. He notes in the accompanying page that the opium pictured here was worth almost 120,000 pounds. Prior to the uprising, tensions over this duplicitous trade exploded in 1839 in the first of multiple opium wars in China, as seen in the billowing cannon smoke painted by a lieutenant who saw the action.
We have focused on artists who worked in Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries, who were trained in different manners of production and in different regions across Britain, India, and China. Artistry within regions is differentiated as well as across regions. In the company official and revenue collector, James Forbes's red leather-bound albums, he writes about and collects works by Indian, Chinese, and Persian artists and uses pigments like Indian yellow. His journeys and representations draw together the commercial and colonial connections undergirded by enslaved and indentured labor across Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Europe. We can trace the cornucopia of fruits that European companies sought almost as a cipher for the bounty to be obtained, as if free, across the globe through his works. Yet he made slight acknowledgments to the cruelty of capitalism and its interlinked networks, from his discussion and depiction of enslaved labor in Brazil, to his portrayal of fruits in Mumbai, to his collection of Chinese still lifes in Gujarat in Western India that had likely traveled from Southeast Asia.
We can also see how soldier artists like Robert Mabon used their skills as draftsmen for official projects, but also used them to grapple with the brutality they encountered. Mabon was unsparing in his small sketches of the corporal punishments and drunken excess of the company's army. Mabon's artistry was tied to being a soldier. The company was invested in the practice and materials of drawing and taught it as a military skill in their academies.
We might return to Jairam Das's portrayal of a man bearing numerous vegetables and grasping fowl, and the owner, who labeled him as a, quote, coolie, unquote, a term used in the colonial archive for the Chinese and South Asian laborers whom the British Empire imported to different regions across their empire to work. Hierarchy and servitude are clearly evident in many of these works.
We can also look to the bread nut and its inscription with the Malay word for the fruit, sukun, indicating that it was likely produced by artists who had migrated from China to Malaysia. They were one of multiple communities across Southeast Asia who produced paintings of flora and fauna, transportation, and processes of manufacture that were exported by East India companies, both British and Dutch. These works are not signed, but rather subsumed under their consistent workshop style of production, trade or export art. By drawing these works together, we want to share what we've learned about a company's art, but also to acknowledge the limits of that knowledge. Much of what we know of these arts is based on company archives, company collectors, and works that have circulated on the art market for decades, if not centuries. Some of the artists' names are now unknown to us or have been obscured by workshop practice or the anonymity of the market.
Our goal in this project has been to hold the power of the company, its global commerce, military force, and intimacy in balance with the artists who worked for company patrons or the commercial market. It is to reckon with the idea of a company, particularly in our age of corporations and their powerful hold on visual communication, as individuals who coalesce into a group that can scale up or down. Seen from its height, the company had a powerful role on aesthetics in this period. This can be seen across the subjects of the works, the materials used, and the manners in which artists worked. But seen from the ground, it is the artists who ingeniously worked in concert with others to both standardize and individuate works of art. who fused artistic traditions and materials together to develop remarkably innovative modes of making, picturing, and selling. This type of market-oriented aesthetic accompanies art, contains commercial goals, systems, and technologies that bear the colonial violence of its proceedings while containing collaborative, unbounded, knowing modes. Thank you.
I'll stand. It's okay. It's okay. Thank you. This was incredible. Such a broad range of things. And I do have a question while everyone else gets ready for questions. And I was thinking about the broad range of paintings and also the balance that you talked about. Okay. I think that is a clear sign that I'm going to be sitting there. Thank you. Yeah. So broad range of very particular kinds of paintings, and thinking about India, China, and so on, making those connections. And Holly, what you said at the end about the balance of holding the kind of the power of the company, but the view from the ground together is a really difficult task. And I think that came through in your presentation as well. And I was really curious about how you're sort of doing that balance. I mean, what's the narrative? How does it work in terms of wall text? Is there anything else that you're using? Especially to think about the bit about the poets and prophets as well, because in some sense the network of painters can become a little bit easier, and they are making the connections as well. The paintings are making the connections for you, I guess, through the tea and the opium and so on. But I was just curious about how much space are you giving networks of extraction and racial capitalism, and where that sits, and how, what your plan is really.
Great question. This is exactly what we've been talking about for the last few years. And what we've been very committed to, even though you're never supposed to do two things in one show, but we are. We're really trying. And the way we've structured the show actually is trying to hold this in balance. So the first room and the first section of the catalog is about the global company as a powerful corporation and how is it making its money. It's making its money through incredibly lucrative commodities, one of which is in fact the military, right? This is, so they are mercenaries, right? So they sell their armies to, that's one of the major ways, alongside these kind of very, very profitable commodities like tea and opium, among others, as well as the sustaining foods, which you don't think about as much, the kind of very regular foodstuffs that they're collecting so many taxes on, right? So I've become obsessed recently with barley, millet, like these kind of very regular foodstuffs that are in fact also hugely profitable for the company. And then we go into the specific regions. Do you want to speak about that?
Yeah, so as we noted, the YCBA collection is really rooted in these specific geographic areas. So the first area that we move into is Calcutta and Patna, and that allows us to kind of really focus on this area and think about the networks of exchange that are happening with artists like the artists of the Impy album or the doilies, and where commerce is layered in botanical representations and doilies' role as an opium agent, but also through the people who are moving through there.
Yep. And from there we go to kind of the different cities. And then the last room, which we've discussed a lot, actually poses a question. So it kind of comes back to this idea of the global, which asks, what are the limits of our knowledge? And it basically is organized around subject matter like architecture, and especially the tank, which is often used for textile production, as well as a source of water, people, animals, and plants again. So again, to ask the viewers, what do you think? Is there a company art, and what does it mean in terms of artistic production in this period?
Oh, super, thank you. Hands in the room. Nick.
Thank you, guys. I can't wait to see this show. It's going to be amazing. I had a question about the collection, and you started saying that the questions were kind of generated out of the YCBA's collections, and I wondered if, as you were thinking through this for the show, if you could tell sort of what distinguishes the kinds of works that go into like family collections or then to the private market versus the ones that stay in institutional collections here or in South Asia or in other parts of the world. Sort of, is there a kind of work that escapes the kind of institution?
That is such a beautiful question. So one thing that's quite interesting about the YCBA's collection is that it also is tied to Mildred Archer in a sense. And we don't, this is a guess. So this is just based on the fact that we know that Paul Mellon was very close with one of Mildred Archer's, with the Archers. And that is how he was able to buy certain works. And that's how we think that he was able to buy the Mallet Whales archive, for instance. So it is in fact still tied to British institutions. But I guess they're different. And I guess I'll refer, in the project that I've been doing with Yutika Sharma, which is on the historiography of company art and company painting, we realized that there was a split in collecting practices. When Mildred Archer returned to London, she brought part of Ishvari Prasad's collection with her. Ishvari Prasad was an incredible artist who also taught Mughal painting at the Calcutta School of Art in the early 20th century. And the collection that she took back was related to the company, but the works of art that he continued to produce in Calcutta and that are in the Indian Museum in Calcutta are connected to the Bengal School of Painting and to nationalist art. And so within an artist, you can see that he was working in these multiple ways. And in fact, they also split institutionally into kind of nationalism and into an institutionalization of company painting. And so you do really see this. And so I think in some ways, maybe it's not a great answer to your question, but I think there are other parts that are not in the YCBA, that are elsewhere, that would tell a different story. And that's why we really wanted to be very upfront about what's in the collection and what we're not doing, because there are very select loans in this exhibition, but it isn't a loan show. So we're not telling the whole story by any means. And we want to be extremely clear about that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Wonderful to hear your excellent project. It looks really extraordinary. I want to ask a very simple question as you're expanding the geography of company, and that I think is a major, contribution of this project. And at the beginning of your lecture, and you spoke about how it's not only where the company had success, it's where they also had ambition. So how has that sort of changed your view on this material from just a specific South Asia focus to working really transregionally?
Yeah, I'd say there are two ways. That's a marvelous question. Thank you so much. I think one aspect that has really kind of just opened, I think, at least for us, we're just at the beginning, and there are many scholars, some of whom are here today, who are part of this, who are doing research on this, is that the networks of artists are vast. And we realize, and Henry Nolte has been doing amazing work on this with the connections between India and China. Ben Pollitt's been working on Indian artists in Australia. There are Chinese and Indian artists working all across the Indian Ocean. And that's just, it's amazing. And it's fabulous. It's just so interesting, and the story is just beginning, basically. And so if anyone knows of anything, just please, again, this is deeply collaborative. This so please tell us. / we'd love to support you in whatever way we can. So that is one thing that's really happened, and the other is through the materials, which is such an exciting aspect.
Yeah, and I think, when we started out on the project, we weren't really sure what we were going to find with the materials, and the use of XRF and Raman is actually a relatively new technique. It's about, this couldn't have been done a decade ago, and so I think we're finding more and more stories that are coming out of the materials, and asking the conservation scientists, please, can you do this one more scan? And they've become very excited about it too. But I think that's really opening up a lot of new questions for us.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in some ways. Style. Well, we can all talk about style, but style, I think, has actually opened up a huge opportunity. At least we think that, in the sense that you really see artists working in a vast number of techniques, multiple hands, multiple ways of making art, and you can just literally see it in the work, and that we've found just hugely exciting, while still recognizing, everyone's using Whatman paper. Oh yeah, they're the paper supplier to the East India Company, right? But then also seeing moments where, Chinese papers are being used, Indian papers are being used. Like there are these moments of back and forth that you can actually see in the materials that you can't find in records, or sometimes in moments of glory. The records and the materials match, and you can match them up and tell richer stories, which is the case with the Mallet Wales archive.
There's another question there.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for the presentation, which was a visual feast, and so interesting to know what is in your archive and what you're going to show. I noticed, though, that and you've partly explained this since the end of your talk, but I noticed that you're geographically very constrained, or not very constrained, but constrained, and that there's nothing really from the south, and so, beyond Pune. And so can you tell us whether there's anything in the collection in Yale from, Hyderabad or Kurnool or Tanjore especially, in this context, where there was such a huge production in the early decades of the 19th century?
Fabulous question, and this is where we see the gap, right? There are very few works from Madras, present-day Chennai, and there are works from Mysore and Seringapatam, but not so much. There are oil paintings, European oil paintings and prints, but not as much. We didn't have. We were focused on both regions in which there were a lot of objects, but also where there were multifaceted stories to tell. And the collections aren't as rich in those areas. And I don't know why, except that for whatever reason, when Paul Mellon was collecting and his networks were really connected to those northern commercial centers. And then it feels like almost by a fluke did the Pune material come to him in this one archive. And again, we just feel so lucky that archive, that archive tells a tremendous stories.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just wonder also whether the fact that some of that South Indian material, Tanjore or from other centres, until comparatively recently, you could still find on Portobello Road. And so it had a sort of less status to it, less cachet perhaps. I certainly remember buying albums of Tanjore paintings on Portobello for £15 or £1,500 or something.
I think we would love to know more about Paul Mellon's desires in collecting this material, and he was really a collector. He liked collecting collections. So I mean, the Wales Mallet Archive is a perfect example of this. And we also have this amazing the Edward Abbey collection, which is what the Lucknow scroll is from, and Abbey collected widely in travel. And so I think that explains some of that. Some of it I think is happenstance and who was collecting before. And who Paul Mellon's own agents were.
Thank you.
But it does bring us back to, like, the British Museum has a phenomenal collection of South Indian works. And so again, if this had been a loan show, it could have been a different picture. But at the same time, I think there is so much value. And actually we found sometimes when you have restrictions, different stories open. And so I think even though this is not comprehensive, it is showing, it's showing a world.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation. And I mean, I think you certainly make the case that in terms of defining a company art, you've certainly got plenty of material for that, which obviously makes sense. I just wanted to ask, did I somehow miss it? But I don't think you explained why you chose the dates, your beginning and end points, which may be very obvious, but it would be nice to be told.
Thank you.
We've wrestled with the dates, and I think we didn't want it to be. We wanted it to be broad. It's like, it's sort of too bad. In some ways, it really should be 1750 to 1850, perhaps. We didn't want it to be framed by political start and end dates, and most of the material falls within this within this range. But it's something that we've gone back and forth and are continuing to go back and forth on.
And we didn't feel right starting with the date of the company's charter, which is 1601, because we have no material before the 1760s. And this actually goes back to South India. At Yale, there are actually 4 remarkable tapestries made in the early 17th century for Elihu Yale, who the name for Yale University, and who was governor of Madras in the 17th century. So there is this very strong company connection to the university, but it just didn't actually fit in the end. It was part of a different moment, and so we ended up kind of after the loose dates. It's related to after when the company really started to gain a territorial foothold in India. And then the first Opium War was kind of our second. And we do mention, and this is, we again discuss the Great Uprising, the first of multiple Great Uprisings in India, in Greater South Asia, 1857, and the Opium War. Those are kind of our ending moments.
And I think another thing for an American audience that isn't as familiar with the company, we didn't want to present a history. It's not a history exhibition, so we didn't want to present it as a history of the company.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for this. It's been really fascinating, in part because I'm a bit of an interloper here, in that I work on the period, but more in the West Indies than East India. So it's really interesting to see what's going on across the globe, as it were. Something that struck me as really familiar from knowing the West Indian context is thinking about those scenes of the tea making and kind of going from the production to the port, and also that scene of the factory with the opium production, because that looks a lot like West Indian imagery that shows plantations, sugar plantations, coffee plantations. And that imagery is very much propaganda imagery commissioned by enslavers in order to justify and kind of glorify the plantation system. And I just wonder, how strong is that element of propaganda and deliberate distortion in producing these beautiful images for the company in this context?
It's a wonderful question. And the opium, let's see. Whoops. Oh, we switched off. But the Opium Book was made for the Great Exhibition in 1851. So absolutely meant to suggest to a British audience, a London audience, that this was a large-scale, clean, almost industrial production, which it wasn't. First, it wasn't industrial. It's primarily handmade, done by incredibly skilled workers, but not in not good conditions, right? So absolutely propaganda. And as Tom has also explored, there are very few images connected to opium production. We have started to find more, like a couple, and Hope Childers has also done so much work on this. And of course, Amitav Ghosh's beautiful, obviously his series of novels, but also his recent book, Smoke and Ashes. And that we are guessing is because it was explicitly illegal, right? There's just no, which is actually one thing that's amazing about this book is how frank it is about saying we're producing opium in India to sell to China when it's just patently illegal. So that is something we're also thinking about. When does visual imagery appear and when does it not appear, and what's hidden? And there are many connections to the West Indies with the company, and we've pulled out some, such as through James Forbes, and we also didn't. There's such tremendous scholarship and work, I'm sure, including your own, on that material that we also didn't want. We weren't able to do it all, but there are moments. This is actually in the secret slides. Let's see if I can go there. Oh, you can see here, related to opium, Shivalal's remarkable paintings on mica of opium production, which actually focus on the labor of the opium makers, and these are on the V&A. An East India Company painting box, actually made for the East India Company. These on the right, this is also from the Mallet Wales archive, and these show Africans living in Gujarat in Western India, and they're wearing guinea cloth, which was exported from India and traded across Africa and the West Indies. And so you have these, this is a tiny, tiny drawing, right? But it does open, oh, this is an interconnected, this is the intimacies of the four continents, as Lisa Lowe so beautifully evokes, that you do see. Yeah. So thank you for that.
And you see it in the making of materials as well, because indigo, the British were importing indigo. Indigo is another pigment that we explore in the exhibition, which was produced in the earlier 18th century in great quantities from South Carolina, but following the American War on plantations through enslaved labor, but following the American Revolution, all of that import basically went to India, and India was importing huge amounts of indigo, mostly for textile dyeing, but also for making pigments. And the ways in which indigo was cultivated in India, they looked to techniques from the American South to bring that kind of enforced labor to India. So there's a real dialogue in terms of that exploitation and labor.
Yeah, thank you. Just listening to both of you, and with the questions, I was trying to think through the slipperiness between, company style and also company site or propaganda, or, that kind of, and where the agency lies. This is not a question, but I know that we'll keep talking about these things, but it does, there is so much to be said about what is needing or wanting to be portrayed and what people do with it as well. And I imagine that will really sort of come alive in the exhibition as well. While we've been focusing on ourselves here, we have a lot of questions from the online audience. So I'm going to at least start with one or two and then go back to the room. They're quite long questions, so I think we'll do them one by one, yeah? So one of them says, I'm curious if Indian yellow was produced for the East India Company, or was it something that was being used in the region simultaneously? Is it still produced? I'm guessing the answer to that is no, but yeah.
The answer, it's been banned since 1908. So it's no longer produced. And it was a local tradition, and exported to Europe for artist use. We know that Turner used it. But it was never it's not sort of an official company product.
Great. And then from Gillian, who can't be here today, thank you, Holly and Laurel, wonderful talk. It's a remarkable and groundbreaking exhibition that will complicate our understanding of company style, moving it beyond Mildred Arger's paradigm. Would you say more about the relationship between the works of Tilly Kettle and Mir Chand? It has always been said that Mir Chand was copying Kettle's compositions, but Holly hinted at a more intriguing possibility, that the two artists had copied each other. Would you elaborate?
Yes. And here I also want to, in doing this work, I'm drawing on Malini Roy's incredible work on this subject, as well as Utica Sharma's, among others. So there is such a rich story regarding artists at the Awadh court, and it seems Tilly Kettle is working for the Nawabs as well as for European patrons who are also working for the Nawab and who are also great collectors of Mughal works. And you can just see how he's painting. He paints with a higher finish when he is in the region, and the types of subjects that he's choosing. And there are so many. There's this now a genre. It's of works that have been defined as after Tilly Kettle, but there are no Tilly Kettles, original ones, that they're referring to. And I just wonder, and this is what when I kept looking at the Shuju Dowla and the and here I also have to I'm this work also sorry, I can't see, is connected to work that Gillian, thank you, Gillian, and Mark Aronson in Paintings Conservation have also done. So a lot of this network idea came because in Paintings Conservation, this painting of a woman, we realized that the left-hand side had been cut down, which raises all sorts of very intriguing possibilities, because once you think, oh, maybe there's more to this painting, who is she looking at, right? And then you look at Mir Chand's work, which actually isn't, you're seeing one painting from what's now known as the Lady Coote album, which was made for Polier by Mir Chand and other artists. And this mysterious painting, which is probably by Navasi Lal for Gentil, maybe, and has been attributed to being of Polier, but I think it's more likely based on a wonderful dissertation, and forgive me, I'm forgetting her name, but I think this is probably Colonel Robert Barker, the translator of the time. And they all, Tilly Kettle had a bibi and children with her. They all were married and had children. So you could see a situation where Tilly Kettle would have been commissioned for a work of a company official and his bibi, or a scene of a dance, although it's very complicated how this could be a dancing scene, which I really don't think it is, that there could be a whole other side to this picture. But the other thing I want to raise, and this is why it's so intriguing, oh no, I messed up. To look, I just wanted to go back to the Mir Chand painting, is Mir Chand he brings together women and men, right? As you see in entertainment scenes. And then all of a sudden one day, I was like, wait a second, That's what Tilly Kettle's doing too. He's just separated them into oil paintings. So maybe we should be thinking about Tilly Kettle working in an album format, even though he's working at a larger scale in oils. And conversely, Mir Chand taking some things from Tilly Kettle, but also adding to what he kind of felt was left out from Tilly Kettle, which was the women in this case. And what's so wonderful, there's a wonderful anecdote that's in one of Mildred Archer's essays about Tilly Kettle, about how the Nawab actually didn't care for Tilly Kettle's paintings. And when Gentil asked to borrow some so that his artists could copy them, he wanted to keep this painting versus the Tilly Kettle. And Gentil was very upset. And the Nawab was like, oh, no big deal. Like, my image is emblazoned on your heart. You don't need this picture. And then Gentil said, oh, well, at least give me the Tilly Kettle. And he did, because that Tilly Kettle is in Versailles now, right, of the Nawab. So you can see that it's actually, there are very, very complex aesthetics that are going on in terms of what is of value, what are the artists looking at, what was Shuja Udawla interested in Tilly Kettle. And so one wonders, oh, maybe it was much more about the composition and the style versus the scale and the rendering in oil, right? So it's very interesting. I mean, we don't have, there's nothing solidified, right? Like we don't have answers, but we do have a lot of questions that I think are raised, especially by this work. And Jillian, thank you for that question. And you're so much a part, obviously, of the discussions around this, as well as Mark.
Thank you. I'm going to paraphrase two longer questions, and I'll do them together so you can answer them. The first one basically asks you to talk a little bit about terms such as Patna Kalam or company Kalam, and yeah, if you wanted to say anything about it in relation to company painting and style. And then the other question is about reproduction, asking whether these works or elements of them get reproduced beyond the auspices of the company, such as in newspapers.
Interesting question. Great question. I can answer the second one quickly. The answer is yes. There's a wonderful example. We actually don't have it here, but another recent acquisition at the Yale Center for British Art is a beautiful painting by Sheikh Muhammad Amir of Karaya, which is a region of Calcutta, and it's of a horse and a groom. And Sheikh Muhammad Amir, we discovered, also did lithographs for the Bengal sporting magazine. And so you can actually see those prints based on his paintings, and he signs the work, and they're signed in the Bengal sporting magazine. And so you definitely do see that. And you see a lot of works also in Asiatic researches, even earlier. And many of Gangaram Tambat's works were printed in Asiatic researches, volume 8. I think. Do you want to the that's
just
a
very short,
hard question.
Yeah.
That's a hard question because we're inspired by the use of a kalam to think about company and kind of to adjust that term to one of style, where artists can enter, they can use it as a style, but also not use a different style, and that you could be any artist. It doesn't matter where you were trained, in what manner you can you can use that style or not use that style. The Patna Kalam, to those in the room, there's a very long and fascinating historiography around Patna painting. And it's connected to Mildred Archer's really extraordinary career. Over 50 years, so many publications. It's her dedication and to this field is remarkable, and it's essential to say that. And her work started with Patna because that's where her husband, W.G. Archer, was based as a company official. And her conception of company art started with Patna and the Patna column. And she was indebted to Ishwari Prasad, this artist, as well as P.C. Manuk, the collector in Patna, great collector, many of his works. In fact, some are in the V&A Great Mughal Show right now. And so I would, and again, if you are interested in this, I do, it's a very long essay, but please read Yuchika Sharma and my essay on this topic. It really delves into some of these questions. But I would say in some ways the Patna column is more specific than a company column, but it does have a long trajectory that one would have to discuss in connection to both of them.
Yeah. And also, we have quite a few more questions online and we're running out of time. So if there are questions that we don't get to, feel free to write to us and we'll pass the questions along to Holly and Laurel as well. Maybe we have time for one last question in the room and one last question online, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Just briefly, thank you for your talk. Could you say something a little bit more about your use of the word workshop? You mentioned the Danielles and described the site of their work as a workshop, and that might conjure up certain sorts of images. And then in Canton, of course, there are other kinds of workshop producing drawings on a industrial scale. Some of them about South Asia, some of them about South American types. It's an incredibly global network by the first half of the 19th century. And then you have the kind of workshops that Henry Naughty talks about and the botanical art that you showed. Are these all the same thing? Are they different kinds of modes of production within these workshops? And it might raise a question about the term artist, but anyway.
Thank you. That's a really great question. And I think one of the things that really interests us in the exhibition is thinking about networks and artists working together. And so I think workshop kind of helps to bring that idea of a somewhat collaborative nature, or the works, certainly some workshops, one person paints the sky and one person paints the architecture. With the Lucknow scroll, we see multiple hands at work where we can identify, well, this sheet was done by one artist and this sheet was done by another. But I think there's also a kind of, even with the Danielles, it can be difficult to tell, well, which is Thomas and which is William at times. And so I think there's that kind of working together, it's a different kind of working together, yeah. But that it's not just kind of the sole single artist, kind of in the kind of romantic concept.
Yeah, and I think something that's really come out strongly in looking at all this material is, in fact, how many of these works were produced by collaboration, whether it's a family of artists like the Danielles, because then Samuel Daniel also becomes a part of that family tradition in some ways, but also how many of the works are in multiple. And the Danielles are part of that. Like, we often think of oil paintings as being singular, and now that's out the window for me, at least. It's like the Danielles would sell reams of oil paintings, in part to support, to fund their print projects, which were more valuable to them. They made more money. And so I think that's also part of it, is just recognizing the emphasis on the multiple. There are multiple artists, there are multiple works. There's this multiplicity that we can also think is connected to a commercial art. And there are definitely differences in the workshops and different scales, but also when artists can work in both. Like, we've seen, like Jairam Das, he can produce unbelievably, you can tell he spent a lot of time on a work of art, and then you can tell that he's like doing something fast, right? It's not always about, it's often about time spent. And that also is quite interesting. And when you think about, even, we've also talked about the impact of Whatman paper. Whatman paper doesn't allow for it's too absorptive. If you're working in a truly refined Mughal technique, it takes so long. It's an extremely labor-intensive technique, which is why it was produced for quartz. And we do see some works at a high level, not quite that high, but at a high level. Those were very expensive works done for specific patrons. If you're working at a larger scale, whether if it's for a scientific project, and we should ask Henry more about this, or for a market, you have to work faster with fewer materials. And actually the paper doesn't actually demands of artists to work in different ways. And that's also something we've been thinking about. What are the different, how do different materials inspire different modes of working?
And actually there was a follow-up question, not a follow-up, there was a separate question, long question, but I'll bring it down to the paper bit, which is about whether all the paper was British or whether you found works painted on paper from other areas, and if so, what? I know you alluded to it in one of your answers, maybe just like one or two examples.
Yeah, so we've been, there are some Dutch papers in our collection too, and we know that Dutch papers were trading in this time, and actually one of the things that Whatman tried to do was try to emulate the quality. Whatman had to produce paper in a different way for exports because kind of traditional British paper was too absorptive in India because of the more humid climate. And one of the things that we did actually in looking at the works by Gangaram Tambat is to analyze all of the different watermarks, and I think we found about 5 or 6. So it's not just Whatman paper that's going. It's I know there are some on Taylor paper and some on I can't. They're not at the top of my head, but there are multiple different kinds of companies exporting paper.
Thanks. There are actually lots of still really interesting questions, but we are well over time. It is a genuine request. If you did want answers to your questions, do write to us, and we will get back to you. But for now, thank you so much for joining us online. And for those of us here, we can say a big thank you to Holly and Laurel and then continue the conversation next door. Thanks.